It's a great honor to be joined today by Dr. Mahzarin Banaji. She is the Richard Clarke Cabot Professor of Social Ethics in the Department of Psychology at Harvard University and the queen of implicit bias research. She's also the co-author of the New York Times Bestseller Blindspot, Hidden Biases of Good People, alongside Tony Greenwald, and the winner of countless awards, including being one of APA's William James Fellows for outstanding contributions to psychology research and a member of the National Academy of Sciences. Mahzarin, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Thank you for having me, Adam.
Thank you. When we first met in my first semester of grad school, you said something that I think is a story I'm going to repeat throughout the rest of my academic career. You said that what we do as social scientists is not rocket science, but it's harder because rocket scientists are dealing with physical things that can be measured in precise ways, and we have to design measures to capture things that we might not even know if they exist, or unconscious measures. Could you expand on that?
The best way to expand on it is to use the words of a physicist, the great polymath Murray Gell-Mann, who said it in a very pithy sentence. He said, "Just imagine if particles could think."
Mm-hmm. Panpsychism.
Pardon me?
Panpsychism.
Panpsychism. But what he's saying is, look, it's complex enough without these particles being able to think. But imagine if they did and how complex our work would be. And we have millions of particles that think to deal with. So that is, in fact, what I mean. I mean in two ways. First of all, rocket science is an outcome of a very old science, physics. And so they've been at it for 2,000 years. So they've had a long history. Partly what's hard about what we do is that we're a much younger science. We're just coming upon sort of the first questions that need to be asked. We've been around 100 years. But the second way in which I mean it is the Gell-Mann way, which is that when you have this black box, and it needs to be figured out without any direct access, that just on the face of it is a whole lot harder. I just finished teaching my penultimate class this semester, and we talked about algorithmic bias in class. And one of the things that people say about algorithms, which is true, is that when they run amok and when they harm us, one of the problems, the source of the problem is that it is a black box. It's not transparent what the algorithm is. And so it's hard to know, what it's doing and why it's doing it that way or what it's even doing. And then I thought to myself, but we constantly deal with another black box, and that's the human mind. Mm-hmm. But we often don't think about it that way. We say, oh my God, I don't know what this algorithm does. But I also don't know what my algorithm is doing. But we feel a lot more confident that we understand what our minds are doing. Whereas this piece of software that we wrote that is using data from us that we have, we find that to be so complicated, right? So I think what I guess I'm trying to say is that black boxes are, in general, pretty hard. Right. And we definitely occupy that part of the intellectual spectrum where we're dealing with a very special and a very complicated black box.
So even recognizing that we have this black box inside our minds, I'm thinking of the cognitive revolution, like I guess from the 50s to 70s onwards, it was much more individual focused. So the idea of whatever the mind is that we're studying, it's something that is housed specifically within individuals and not necessarily taking into account the broader social, cultural context that shapes our mind that your research later gets to. How did you first get into psychology and bringing in this social, cultural perspective? And I imagine this was a newer area of research.
It sure was when I went to college. So when I went to college, I took some psychology, but the psychology I studied, and this was in South India, was mostly psychophysics. That was, it was more advanced. We knew something about psychophysics, so that's what I studied. And I guess I loved the method, but not enough that I thought I'm going to become a psychologist. So I strayed away for a little while, and I went to fields like philosophy and even sociology. And I was in the process of doing that when, on a trip home from school, my train. This is a distance of about over 1,000 miles from New Delhi to where I lived in South India, and being on an Indian train is a whole experience in and of itself. The train stops in big junctions, and the the platform is, like a city. There are people selling things and food, and it's bustling around with lots of people. And I walked into a bookstore on the platform that had, sitting on the floor, a pile of big fat red books, and it said Handbook of Social Psychology. And I didn't know anything about that field. And I looked at them and I asked the guy how much he was selling them for, and he said, roughly, translated into about $1 a book. And I said, but look at all the dust that's collected on these. Surely you can sell them to me for less than that. And I think he may have given me the whole set for a couple of bucks. But I had with me now 5 volumes of the Handbook of Social Psychology. And on the train, before I got home, I had polished off the first volume. And that volume mostly had many different theories of social psychology. I understood very little of what they were saying or why they were curious about what they seemed to be curious about. What grabbed me was a chapter on research methodology. And it was a chapter written by Elliot Aronson, a social psychologist, in which he was just describing some of the fundamentals of social psychology, the mode room experiment and how that was done, the Latimer and Darley experiment, and of course the dissonance studies, the first studies that had been done on cognitive dissonance. This was the 1968 handbook. And my jaw just dropped. I couldn't believe that there were people somewhere in the world who were studying social behavior, but not like any other group I had ever seen study social behavior. They were studying it experimentally. They were bringing it into a lab. They were doing remarkable things like having people do boring tasks and then tell a lie about how interesting it was, and then paying them $1 or $20 and showing these completely counterintuitive results that the people who had been paid $1 were more persuaded about how much they liked the test than the people who had been paid $20. None of this made any sense, but it made so much sense that this is how human nature might actually be. And it was this combination of wanting to understand the social world, but using the methods of experimental psychology, that I found completely freeing. And I just knew in that moment, in a way, I think I have rarely ever had that kind of clarity. But I did in that moment just know this is what I want to do. But how do I do it? Where do I go? And that's a whole other story of how I then came to apply to schools in the United States, and arrived with a very large suitcase filled with 5 volumes of the Handbook of Social Psychology, and with one long sleeved cotton shirt because I'd been told it was cold in Ohio.
Was it?
It was not cold in September, but in a couple of months, that cotton shirt was worth nothing.
I know in modern social psychology research, you're starting to see some bridges to evolutionary psychology and even cross species work on social cognition and making sense of like in-group out-group biases that we have from an evolutionary perspective. Was any of that present in this early social psychology research that you mentioned?
It was not, and I would say much to the detriment of social psychology. So I think in those days the field was sort of carved up into people who were various kinds of psychologists. But even within the entire spectrum of psychology, I don't think that there were very many people who were interested or cared to connect to evolutionary theories. So cognitive psychologists certainly did not. They assumed that there was a brain there, that it evolved in a certain way. They were not going to deny that. But there wasn't an evolutionary account to understand perception or memory or whatever. And I don't think that's still the case. And then there were people who really took the nature nurture divide in a very radical, literal way, and felt that you had to argue at every given point about whether it was X or Y. And this came largely because of some of the horrors of the nature point of view. The nature point of view had indeed put out there many, many theories of different race differences in IQ or gender differences in this way and that. And philosophers for a very long time had used those to support theories of the inferiority of particular groups over other groups. So the nurture people were responding to that. They saw that as evolutionary psychology, and they didn't want any part of it. This was a huge mistake because, as we know today, it would be stupid to not think of the two as completely joined and intertwined, and that knowing the one has to inform the other. And there are no, at least I don't perceive any threats from one point of view uh, to the other or for the other. So when I study bias, how can I not care about where it's coming from? Like, how can I not care about our own evolutionary history and what my ancestors and yours would have had to deal with in a world very different than the world we live in today, and why some of the ways in which we think and feel, especially at this automatic level, does contain the vestiges of an older world in which the brain evolved.
You're most well known for your work on automatic or implicit bias, which I'm excited to get to. But what happened in the meantime between graduate school and developing the implicit bias test, which was in the 90s, I think?
Mm-hmm. That's correct. Yeah. So around, so when you there's certain parts of our work that are very well known and are in the public eye, so people know those. But as with anything, the story is always more complicated. There were precursors. There were many people who had done lots of really beautiful work that came before our own, and we were simply standing on the shoulders of those giants. In graduate school, I became fascinated with one topic, and that was human memory. I was interested in studying it. I happened to be in a social psychology program, but it was a very ecumenical program where you could do anything you wanted. And I wandered over to the cognitive psychologist, my own mentor, Tony Greenwald, was sort of a hybrid in some ways. And so I was interested in memory, but not memory as in, how many words can you remember from a list? Memory as in what social psychologists were thinking about at the time is how shall we think about the self was a question. Personality theorists think about the self in terms of traits and so on. But if you took a cognitive view of the self, then could we think about the self as a memory system, um, a way in which information that happens to be relevant to the self is encoded in some special way? And so I did my first piece of work on the self as a memory system. I became interested while doing that work in memory for emotional events. So again, that's not your typical bread and butter work that was being studied by cognitive psychologists. One of the things that I always say about social psychologists is that they always do what everybody else isn't doing. And so while the cognitive revolution for the cognitive psychologist was a very big deal, it wasn't for social psychologists because they were always doing cognitive psychology. They didn't care that there was a behaviorist revolution and that you were not supposed to study the mind. They just set those people aside and they did it. In fact, Leon Festinger's book, A Theory of Cognitive Dissonance, was written in the mid 50s at the height of behaviorism. But then the cognitive revolution happened, people came to their senses, and then they began to do cognitive psychology. So what did the social psychologists do? They said, well, nobody's studying emotion. So they wandered off and they became quite interested. And I came in at that stage. And so I was very interested in the status of emotional information of different kinds, differences in valence, differences in intensity, and its status in memory. Do we remember intensely positive and negative stuff equally well? Or is there a valence effect on top of it? So that was what my dissertation work was on. And then I went off to the University of Washington to do a postdoc um, with Beth Loftus, who was the queen of memory research, and Claude Steele, who was a social psychologist. And we looked at the effects of alcohol on memory. What does drinking 3 drinks in 20 minutes do to memory, but also what does it do to your self-concept and so on. So when I arrived at Yale, which was my first job, I would say I was just pretty much a dilettante. I mean, I had, done a little of this and that. I didn't come into my assistant professorship the way our junior faculty today come into an assistant professorship. They come with a line of work that they've published that identifies what they're interested in, and they very quickly get to work to do more and more of it with amazing students like you. That's not what I was like at all. And there were others as well who were more like me than people today. So I wasn't completely unique. I may have just been a little bit more flaky than even others at the time, in that I didn't come in with a particular point of view that I was going to go there and do this. What was on my side was that Yale did not have a tenure track. So a few places, Harvard, Yale among them, would hire junior faculty into a 5-year contract, at least that's what it was at Yale at the time, that was renewable for another possible 5 years. So I knew coming in that I was not on tenure track, that I might stay at Yale for 5 years, and then if they liked what I was doing, they might give me an extension for another 5. So I always joked that I was not, I was not a tenure, but it was 10 years, and that to me seemed just fine. 10 years with amazing colleagues and incredible students. So I, of course, being interested in memory, would attend a weekly meeting called Memory Lunch, just like our brown bags. And this was mostly my colleague Bob Crowder, who studied auditory cognition, and I, and students who wanted to come. It was a journal club. We would read an article that we thought was interesting, and we would talk about it. And when it came my turn to present in one semester, I think I presented a study done by Larry Jacoby. And this was a study in which he'd shown that if you pull names out of a phone book, names like Sebastian Weisdorf, that if you've seen that name, you acquire a certain level of perceptual fluency for that name, Sebastian Weisdorf. 2 days later, if somebody says, hey, Sebastian Weisdorf, what did he do? You might think, oh, I remember, that sounds familiar. Oh, is he that Canadian hockey player or something like that, right? You might mischaracterize the person as being famous because you are under conditions of uncertainty in a Kahneman Tversky kind of way. And under those conditions of uncertainty, you can't tell, is this name feeling familiar to me because I saw it 2 days ago? Is it because of an episodic memory I have? Or is this person feeling familiar to me because the person is famous, is a hockey player? And so Larry had shown in his work that if a name has been seen before, and especially under conditions where you've forgotten, your explicit memory for it is gone, implicit memory for that information will kick in and lead you to false alarm on those names and see them to be famous when in fact they're not. And so he called this effect the becoming famous overnight effect, and he had published this paper and I presented it. And I thought that since I was interested in memory, and of course all around me, people like Dan Schachter, people like Larry Jacoby, people like Roddy Roediger, the hot thing happening in research on memory was the discovery of this new form of memory called implicit memory. And so I decided to replicate that study, but I asked Larry for his stimuli, and he sent them to me. And as I joke, I wrote back to him and said, you've only sent me half your stimuli because there are only male names in this list. And I chatted, and he said, well, it was very hard to find famous women, and it was 1988. And so I didn't challenge that. I mean, this is something that students should know, that in 1998, if somebody said to you, I didn't use both kinds of names because women aren't famous, that was a completely reasonable thing to say for an experiment in psychology. Why would you have to include all kinds of names? Pick the ones where you know that they'll all be the same and will have reached some level of fame that is present, and then do your experiment on that.
You see the same even in historical animal research. I've been doing work with Leah on brain development and puberty and hormones, and a lot of the classic research on this comes from rodent studies. Exactly. And it's all typical, male. All male, exactly.
There's a paper I think that was written called Even the White Rat was male and white. So it seemed completely normal. And think about the rodent experiments you mentioned. It is a hassle. You have female rodents, they're going to menstruate. It's going to wreck your study. You got to pull them out and put some other, it'll slow it down. So, yes, you can understand that for many reasons. But if this happens over and over again, then we understand the psychology of one kind of being and not another. But I just want to be honest and say, when I came upon this idea of this work, I did not feel any pressure to include all kinds of names. However, and this I hope is also interesting to your listeners, I don't know why, and I cannot tell you that I know why even today, why I spent an entire summer trying to find names of famous men and women. But I just felt that if I was going to replicate the study, I should include them. Not because I thought what Larry had done was wrong, not because I thought that I couldn't go off and just do the same thing, but something in me just made me do this. And I have to assume that it had to do with my being female. That had I been a man, I would have most likely done exactly what was needed to be done, replicate the study, and then take it from there. Anyway, so long story short, I do the study with both male and female names, totally expecting that both names are going to become famous overnight if they've been heard before, but not if they were new names that you hadn't seen before. And we got the old new effect, but on top of that, there was a substantial gender difference. Male names did become famous overnight. In some experiments, female names also became famous overnight, but not nearly as much. And in some other studies, they barely got off the ground. They did not become famous overnight. And that was just stunning to me. So after the first couple of experiments, I began to quiz my subjects. I would say, what do you think affected your performance? Did you find some names feeling like you should identify them as famous? And they would say, oh, yes, if I'd seen a name before, I felt like maybe I was getting screwed up a little bit. So they figured out the implicit memory hypothesis. They knew that they might be making mistakes on names they'd seen before. So then I would say, what about the gender of the name? I didn't use the gender of the name in my decision. And so there was this contrast between a complete lack of introspective access to what they were doing, which is to selectively identify male names to be famous, but not equally familiar female names, and a complete lack of that awareness, and yet there it is in their behavior. So I think that's another moment in which I think I made a good decision. Everybody said to me, keep doing your work on memory because you invested in it, you know something about it. This is a very interesting area. It'll take you somewhere. And I just thought, no, that's not what's most interesting. Yes, implicit memory is great, and many people are working on it. But how could these people, how could they not know that they were doing this? And by this, I knew that that little circling of a name as famous or not famous, I just knew that if they can do that, they could do the same for names of criminals. Who seems to you to be more likely to be a criminal? We did some studies on that. And then I knew that if this is true, if people are doing this and they're not aware, then everything we believe in is up in the air. All questions of did you intend to harm or did you not intend to harm? Of course, there was no intent on the part of any of the subjects to harm women. But in a sense, that's what they were doing. They were not selecting them in the same way.
You mentioned at the time, and maybe in the present day, there are just more famous men. So now, standing on the shoulders of giants, I can't help but think of this in Bayesian terms, which is to say, we have a predictive model of the world, and we, throughout our lifetimes, acquire prior information. So that becomes our starting place. And one prior you might acquire throughout your lifetime is there are just more famous men. So you come across a random male name that you're slightly familiar with and a random female name, and you don't know where either of them are from, but you think there are more famous men out there. So that could lead to this gender difference that you're describing.
Absolutely. So that's how I explained it at the time. No motivation to harm anybody. Mm-hmm. That's your Bayesian net is set up for you, and it is. Let me give you an example of a study that I think will fit in your mind. But you'll see how interesting this is. This is a study I did with a student of mine who's no longer in the lab or in the field. He works for Facebook with Jack Chow. And what Jack and I did is to tell people that here's a scenario that we tell others. We tell them, somebody performs surgery. The person could either be male or female. Uh, who's likely to have performed this surgery, the man or the woman? And we tell them that when we tell people this, there are some people who say, of course it's the man. What do you think of this person? And our subjects would get really upset about such a person. They would say the person, is a sexist, and they write paragraphs of just pure vitriol about who are these horrible people who are saying that the man is the surgeon. Of course, equally. Blah, blah, blah. And then in other studies, we give people the actual problem to solve, and they're very good Bayesians. So this paper is titled something like, people find reprehensible certain behaviors that they demonstrate themselves. So they're being decent Bayesians. They are using gender to some extent in making that judgment, because all things being equal, your priors, who a surgeon is likely to be, should enter. You might control for it to some extent, but unless the world gives you evidence to the contrary, it's certainly accurate in that moment to say that. Right? But here we are in a moral universe where we think that saying that is a horrible thing. Right? Mm-hmm. So there are just, but that is interesting, because normatively speaking, it is interesting, right? So these days, what I find fascinating is, for example, if you have a word, a phrase in Turkish, which has gender neutral pronouns. So o bir doctor means this person is a doctor. O bir hemşire, this person is a nurse. Okay? When Google translates that from Turkish into English, Google translates it as, he is a doctor, she is a nurse. Because Google is doing exactly what you were saying. It has looked at the number of times male and surgeon and doctor and female and nurse have been associated, and it's picking what is the most common pronoun. Mm-hmm. But we could have a long discussion, you and I, about whether that's correct in our world to do. In one sense, it's completely correct. It's picking the most likely gender group for each. But now you and I think would both agree that if Google is doing this, it is adding into the universe of information an additional identification of male with doctor and female with surgeon that is not true. It's just making it up there, right? And doing
right.
That.
So another example of algorithmic bias.
Another example of algorithmic bias. And so Google went in and fixed it. So now if you go do it, it'll say he/she is a doctor, she/he is a nurse.
So it still orders it in order.
It still orders it, but it's telling you it need not be only one or the other, which I think is a great way to solve it. My only worry is that we can't wait around for Google to listen to, the chatter on Twitter and then go change it for that particular profession. This needs to get generalized enough that you see it for teacher and secretary and nurse and astronaut and engineer and everything. Right. Yeah.
Now, at the time, was this formalized computationally as what people are doing when thinking about social cognition and memory, or thinking about stereotypes, that it is in this Bayesian framework of, you have these biases, but maybe they are reflecting some statistical reality of just what you've been exposed to throughout your lifetime?
It's a very good question, Adam, because I can tell you that there were some of us who were not using those words, but we were saying that. Mm-hmm. And then there were others who were up in arms about that, because they thought what we were saying is that we were endorsing stereotyping. And we were saying the two are separate. One is to understand how the mind works. Then the other is to say, what kind of universe do we want to live in, and how do we want to shape the kind of universe we want to be in? But that the latter should not conflate the former, conflate it with the former, right? And that was a huge challenge. I remember students in my social cognition graduate seminar just arguing with me on these particular issues. But it seemed right to me. It seemed right to me to say that stereotypes, often people think the word stereotype means something bad, but it doesn't, right? Today we understand that stereotypes can work. But the word bias, I define it in a very neutral way. It doesn't mean that it's a bad thing. I do have a bias that favors the Red Sox massively over the Yankees. I think it's a pretty fine bias and one I'm not about to change. Mm-hmm. I, in fact, may want to strengthen it if only my team would play a little bit better. But that's that's an example, right, of something where I feel that it's quite and I can even morally justify it. The Yankees dominate in baseball. There are as many crazy Yankee fans as there are Red Sox fans. We're equal in society at some level. My preference for this group is not producing any harm, and so um, my IAT and many people's shows a preference for green leafy vegetables over red meat. If I have such an implicit bias, I think that's a very fine bias. It's going to make me healthy. So their bias itself is not good or bad. It has to do with question number one: how deviant is it from reality, from accuracy? If there are two candidates in front of me, and the dark skinned candidate is more competent than the light skinned candidate in that context, and I pick the light skinned one, that's a bias. That's a bias that shows a deviation from accuracy in some way. And then we want to worry about it. Mm-hmm. Or it may not be a deviation from accuracy because in many cases the decision is subjective. It's not about accuracy. It's just how much do you like red versus blue? I can like one and you can like the other. But let's say I want to love red, but my behavior shows a deviation in the direction of blue. Then again, it's a bias of an interesting sort because it's a deviation from what my espoused values are. I want to be an egalitarian. My behavior shows otherwise. Now I need to worry about it because it's a deviation from my values.
In Blindspot, you talk about these things called mind bugs, which is an interesting term because on one hand, it's something that we've evolved. It's just built into our minds, and we can't help but have these biases in our thinking. But on the other hand, people have this implicit association of bug is bad, and sometimes they are very harmful mind bugs.
Mm-hmm. So that's why we use it in the sense in the sense in which I think the original use of it was children showing mind bugs in when they had to learn subtraction and they couldn't figure out the carrying over problem, and they would make these systematic errors when they were learning subtraction. There would be this little hump that they had to get over. All of us, I guess, did, and and the author had used the term mind bugs to capture that, and I just borrowed it because I loved it. So for a long time, I gave talks with that title. And yes, you're right. It is indeed that when you call it a mind bug, you're saying there's something buggy in your software. It's causing a kind of a hiccup or even the program to stall altogether. Wouldn't we want to know what those are so that we can do it better?
Implicit bias is one such example of a mind bug, but as we mentioned, it doesn't necessarily have to be bias in the negative way we normally talk about it. It can be a bias in your training data throughout the lifespan. So if you're raised in America or a predominantly white culture and you have a bias towards whites, whether that's just familiarity based, um, you're gonna maybe we should outline what the implicit bias test is doing before getting into this. So listeners can check it out at Project Implicit online, and you can take it from there.
Right. So in 1994, Tony Greenwald and I had a grant, and the grant was written with the purpose of following up on some of the false fame work, but also the grant proposal said we would like to try to build a method that will produce evidence of bias in a, what do we say, in a kind of a more stark or clear way. So there had been methods before that. You must know this method called sequential priming. If you want to look at the semantic connection between two words, it's very easy to find it by showing that when you flash the word king, followed very quickly by the word queen, and your job is to decide is queen a word or not a word, you'll be much more likely to say queen is a word correctly when it's preceded by king rather than something irrelevant like cloud. So cloud and queen will not lead to a fast response on queen in the same way as king and queen will lead to a faster response on queen. And that faster response to queen is giving you a little indication of the strength of association between king and queen. And your control condition is cloud and queen. A difference in that response rate across those two sets of primes and targets is telling you these two are more connected, those two are less connected. Right? So those methods did exist. I had used many of them, and in fact, I had begun to study with my very first graduate student, Curtis Hardin. We had looked at words because when I was at Yale, people were talking about words like, why can't we just call all people who are chairs of departments chairman? It's true, women are now starting to be chairman, but why can't we just call them chairman? Like, what's the big deal? We need to call them chairwoman. That just sounded to people really strange. And some of us would make, arguments like, but there are so many words for which how weird would it be if we said chair white? We don't do that. So why do we feel like chair has to be chairman? And we have these endless conversations. And undergraduate students would be up in a tizzy if I said, please write with gender neutral language. So that was the fight on campuses. And so we said, let's do studies, and we did sequential priming studies in which you would see words like John followed by chairman, or Jane followed by chairman, or vice versa, chairman and then John, or chairman and then Jane. And we would look at the speed of responding, and we showed that all of these words, the word contains a male morpheme, it is going to get faster responses to males. So the methods did exist. That's what I want to say. But the effects on these kinds of methods, because they were of theoretical interest mainly to understand, what semantic memory was, the effect sizes would be on the order of, the differences in reaction time would be on the order of 8 and 10 milliseconds. Now, they would be highly reliable, but you'd have to run 80 people, each of whom gave you data on 500 to 800 trials. So for an hour, you would be doing this, and then out of it, you could say the patterns of data were always there, and they were always beautiful in the order in which you would predict. But the effects are tiny. And so I think what bothered Tony Greenwald more than even me was, can't we find a method that can produce larger effects? And in 1994, the IAT was actually sent to me by him. He had put the program together, and he just said, try this. And in this little experiment I had to, we used to send this to each other a lot. So we were used to receiving, little programs that we could run, because I always say that we were very lucky, because in very few parts of science can an experimenter be a subject in her own experiment, right? If you're a physicist, you cannot be the particle. In many parts of our science, if people are designing surveys or even beautiful analogical reasoning problems or Bayesian problems that you are giving people to solve, you can't be a subject in that study because you know what the hypothesis is. This is like a tiny little piece of research where you can be a subject in your own study, in very much the same way as somebody who studies vision can be a subject in their own optical illusion study, right? And so I took this test that required me to associate black and white at the time names with good and bad words. And I knew what I would show. I could do this equally. I've been studying bias now for a few years. And I didn't. I could not associate black with good as quickly as I could associate white with good. And my first thought, Adam, was the test is screwed up. Something's wrong with the test, must have given. So I'm very understanding even today when people's first reaction to taking the IAT is, that can't be true. Something's wrong with the test. I understand it completely. I did the same thing. But I knew every line of that code. I knew what that program was doing. And so very quickly I realized, the test is not screwed up. It's my head that's screwed up. And I have to understand how that's happening. And so that was the beginning.
To make sense of this, first with the king and queen example, I was thinking of an analogy of what your mind is doing. Imagine your mind and all your knowledge is just a vast library, and you have different shelves, and there are different categories. So like king and queen are going to be in the same like monarch category. So you go to the same bookshelf, and you're going to be faster at linking those two together because you don't have to travel across the library. And that makes sense when you're thinking about semantic categories. But then when you get to something like an implicit bias of white equals good, black equals bad, that analogy starts to fall apart.
It doesn't fall apart. The analogy still holds, but our minds are not going to be as open to that. Because just as king and queen have been shelved together, white and good things have been shelved together for centuries. So I do think that when people have trouble with it, or take something like forget the good and bad, which is more so there were studies, by the way, I should say for the nerds who are listening, just as there have been studies of semantic priming, king priming queen, chairman priming John more so than Jane, there was a group of people who had said, what if two words are semantically completely unrelated to each other, but they have something affectively in common? So a word like cloud and priest, they have nothing in common semantically, but if they sit somewhere similarly on an evaluative spectrum, but let's take a very clear example: ice cream and honest. Ice cream is good, honest is good. They have nothing to do with each other. Can one prime the other? And Russ Fazio and John Barge had shown, yes, they can. That's a very well established. They call this automatic attitudes. So even before we came in, people had done this work. What we were doing was not new, other than that we had a method that slapped you in the face in a way in which these priming methods that existed did not. But even affective priming had been demonstrated. So now, white and good, they may be semantically associated, but they were obviously affectively associated because they sat on the same emotion shelf in the library. And so did black and bad. And now we know when we look at large language corpora that what we see on the IAT data that come from individual human minds measured in milliseconds, can be seen almost exactly in the same way to exist in our language if we use something like cosine similarity to measure the angle between mother and kitchen, or white and good, and then black and good. And so the closer the angle is smaller, the further apart the angle is wider. And computer scientists like Eileen Calliskin took the IAT data and then showed that if you go into the Common Crawl, the language of the internet, grabbed at two different moments in time, 850 billion words, and you look at those trained databases by looking at how close those white and good words are to each other and black and good words are, you'll see exactly what we see in humans in the language data.
And even among people like yourself, or hopefully everyone who's listening, where there's no such conscious bias, and if anything, a conscious desire not to have the bias, you still see the strong effect, and it seems to be a result of just all of this statistical learning about everything you see in media and throughout history, and just this association that is instantiated in our culture.
I would say you're absolutely correct. I would even go a little bit further and say that is this, if there's one result that we want to pull out and say, in the last 50 years we've been at this is the one most important thing that we've learned about implicit bias, I would say that signature result is a disparity between what we consciously espouse, what we value, what we think we are, and then on the other hand, what we actually are, which is what we see under implicit measures, which is another side of ourselves. I'm not going to argue that the implicit side is more important than the explicit, or vice versa, but I will say that the two often don't go together. And to me, that's incredibly interesting. People often ask me why I don't study people with explicit bias. And I say I find them psychologically uninteresting, because they tell me that they hate A over B, their test result likely shows that they hate A over B. What's there to talk about? It's people like us, people of good values, who say, I am egalitarian, I'm fair, I don't care about what a person looks like. I've heard this so many times. It began in, I think, the 1980s. I don't care if a candidate is pink, blue, red, or purple. I just want talent. Those are the people to whom I want to speak and say, you may want that, but it turns out that you like the purples more than the others. You just didn't know that.
Mm-hmm. And this is where the research can get misinterpreted, or maybe becomes controversial because of those misinterpretations. I want to ask you whether it is genuinely that we have this implicit bias in the sense of you unconsciously like one thing more than the other versus you're just more familiar with it, and that leads to faster reaction time, but there's no normative judgment there whatsoever.
So that's a very fine question, and one of the things we start to do when that happens is to actually try to look at is the IAT detecting nothing but familiarity effects? And it's a very good question, and I certainly even today believe that it has the roots of familiarity. And if you're a developmentalist, you would understand this very quickly because babies show those roots of liking things that are familiar in a most pristine way. So familiarity is definitely involved in this. I will argue, but that familiarity has sitting on top of it and covering all of it a certain preference. Okay? Something that actually discriminates and says, I want this more than that. I like this more than that. I believe this is smarter than that. This is, better than that. And so we'll come to that. But if you're a child, I mean, one of my favorite studies was done by a student in Miss Belkey's lab, Tali Ziv. She did a study, I think this was with 6-month-olds, looking at Ethiopian Jews in Ethiopia and showing that 6-month-old Ethiopian Jews, Jewish babies, prefer dark-skinned people to light-skinned people. That's what they're familiar with. Okay? Then she does the study with Ashkenazi Jews in Israel and shows the exact opposite symmetric result, that Ashkenazi Jewish babies prefer light-skinned people to dark-skinned people. And then she looked at Ethiopian Jews who had moved from Ethiopia to Israel and had caregivers of both skin tones and showed that they had no bias at all. To me, this is a perfect study that shows us very clearly what the effects of familiarity are. And when we say babies have a preference, we're not saying anything more than that the baby is looking more at one over the other, is finding one. We can lay on top of that the baby likes the light skin, but I don't think we should. I think we should stay away from that. We should say they seem to like the kind of people who they have gotten used to. But if that's the case, then we should always like the familiar more. And African Americans don't show that effect. They just don't. So let's finish up the familiarity bit just a little bit, because I think that there's more to it than familiarity, because we see that certain dominance in a certain culture is preferred. So wherever we find strong implicit preference, it seems to be in people who are dominant in that society. So white Americans show strong white preference. Black Americans do not. They're neutral. And it's not just Black Americans. We've seen this in Black people everywhere, in South Africa, for example. So we know that it can't be just familiarity. But the second way in which we know it's not just familiarity is because of the data that have come out of other people's labs today, not my own, where they do something fascinating. Because our data are huge, and because we put them in a publicly accessible place, anybody, an economist colleague of mine, Rod Chetty, did this. He took the IAT data that we have out there, organized it by county, and took the average IAT score for each county. I think maybe he did it by state, but let's say county or state, some region. He's not interested in everything. He's interested in upward mobility. Who gets to make more money than their parents did? And sadly, in the United States, many people no longer make more money than their parents did. So he talks about that as sort of failure of the American dream. But certainly some people more so than others. And what Raj found is that the degree of race bias regionally, county by county or state by state, predicts the difference in Black and white mobility. Right? So in states where IAT bias is high, are there states where Black people are much less upward mobile compared to white people, right? Versus the states where it's the opposite. Now, that's harder to explain by just familiarity. Right? There's something in the air. And there are now more than a dozen such things. I think that we've counted up to 18 or 20 or so of them, where the degree of bias in a region, the higher the race bias in the region, the greater the lethal use of force by police. The greater the IAT race bias in a region, the greater the race difference in maternal health, infant health, etc. greater the race bias, the greater the differences in school disciplining between black and white kids, for example. So these correlations are telling us that something. Now it's a correlation. I would never say implicit bias is causing these, nor would I say that those causes of racial disparities are causing the IAT. They're probably interconnected in some way. Most likely, there's something, a third variable out there that's causing the both. And that could be what many psychologists today say is sort of the bias of crowds, the fact that there's something in the air that has lasted over a long period of time. Heath Payne would say what happened in 1860 predicts what we will see in counties today.
At the very least, it's familiarity with the fact that some areas are more racist than others, and you're going to be exposed to that and pick up on these patterns more so than others.
Yes, I would say yes, but it's not like I only like what's familiar. I think that's that because if anything, so here's another result that would contradict. I think the familiar. I haven't brought this through fully, but counter to our intuition, areas that are racially more diverse show more anti-black bias. In other words, you're seeing more of them. Areas where there are more fat people show greater anti-fat bias.
And that's opposite to what you see with the babies, where if they're exposed to it, they don't have bias.
Exactly. So it depends in what context are you seeing them. Being overweight is not a positive thing in our culture. And so when you see more of them, it generates greater negativity. And so it's not just familiarity. It has to do with familiarity being the roots of this effect that we eventually see.
Raj Chetty's work taking the IAT data and combining it with geographic data is a great example of ways that this work has been expanded upon. I know more recently you've been doing natural language processing research with implicit bias. Can you talk about that?
Sure. I mentioned the work of Eileen Caliskin, this computer scientist. When she was a postdoc, she just did the study in which she looked at, the database that we today call the Common Crawl, and showed that in that database of 850 billion words, you see patterns that are very similar to what the IAT had shown. And she came up with a little measure that she calls the WEAT, the Word Embeddings Association Test, as a parallel to the IAT. So you can now put those together. I thought that study was fascinating. And a student of mine, Tessa Charlesworth, was doing early in her career, she had done a couple of studies with young children in the Children's Museum here in Boston. And I had heard this many, many times in the developmental work that I'd done with students in a previous decade, where parents would say to us, I don't understand where my children are getting these biases from. We never say anything like this in the house. We would never say, if you're a girl, you can't do this or that. Where is this stuff coming from? And we would try to say to them, well, first of all, you're not the only influences on your child. And even you may say certain things that might actually be the building blocks of these stereotypes. And they would not be happy to hear that. And because parents try really, really hard. This is back to the issue you and I spoke about earlier. The intent is good. And certainly these Boston, Cambridge parents were really trying hard to make sure that their children did not learn any of these biases. So Tessa got a data set called the Child's data set, CHILDES, which consists of parent-child conversations. And she looked at that data set, she looked at TV shows, she looked at stories that we tell children, and did a very similar analysis to see if gender stereotypes exist in this language, especially the parent-child conversations. And these conversations are rife with bias. It's just the parents aren't aware of it. And you see why a parent might hold the view, we are not being sexist. How is our child learning this? While also every day saying things like, where's mommy? Mommy's in the kitchen. Where's daddy? Daddy's at work. Well, that's the basis. That's what our test picks up. So that was the first study that we did. And now there are dozens and dozens more.
Mahzarin, you're smiling as you talk about this. And for someone who's new to it, it seems scary. It's a bit pessimistic, right? What is the optimistic take we can take away from this research?
So I had been led by the data to be a complete and utter pessimist about what we should expect. I guess I'm smiling because in recent years, my students have done research to suggest that things may not be as bad as you think they are. Um, or rather, things are bad, but that they can improve. And they come in two kinds of categories. Research by Benedict Purdy has been showing that yes, we learn very rapidly who's the good one and who's the bad one, but by giving people causal explanations for why bad may have been bad, you can flip it around, which is kind of shocking to me, stunning. I would never have thought that whatever constitutes implicit cognition is sensitive to these kinds of propositional inputs that can make us change an association that we've learned and flip it to be something quite opposite of it is. So that gives me some optimism. And Tessa has done research that shows that if we look at the IET over time, from 2007 to today, what we are seeing is that certain kinds of biases are dropping off extremely fast. So anti-gay biases come down by 64%. I'll let your listeners and viewers think about why that is the case. Okay? What about race bias? It turns out, yes, race bias too has come down, but not nearly at the same level. So by about 25%. Okay? There are some biases that have changed similarly. Gender bias, where we associate female with home and male with career. That bias has come down. A bias associating male with science and female with arts, that's come down by 25%. But we can ask the question, why 25% and not 64? What is it about anti-gay bias that has allowed it to come down so fast? And across all groups of people, conservatives and liberals, and the coasts in the middle of the country, and rich and poor, and educated and less educated. Yes, she shows that two groups in our culture are changing faster than any other groups, and they're people who are young and people who are self-professed liberals. For those two groups, they've actually already reached neutrality on the anti-gay bias test, or the sexuality test, as we would call it. And so we're seeing these. There are some biases that are not changing at all. They seem really stuck. And anti-elderly bias is very difficult to remove, it seems. It's not been changing. Disability bias, not changing, maybe by 2%, something like that. And anti-overweight bias, so that bias is not changing. So we can then talk in our labs about why. Why are some not changing at all? Others are changing somewhat, and still others are changing really rapidly. And I think if we can figure this out and model it, we might be on our way to figuring out what we might do about implicit bias.
Those last three that you mentioned seem to have some health in common. So it does seem there's something more factual about it, whereas other things like race or sexuality, it's becoming harder and harder to make any case for why this would be negative.
Yeah, and media has done a lot. So, I worry a little bit that the race bias improvement may simply be kind of like, I'll just say, a Beyonce effect. So there are a few very, very salient African Americans in our culture in the areas of music, entertainment, sports, who may be playing a disproportionate role in making that bias drop away. But as a result, we shouldn't assume that the average Black person on the street is going to be treated any differently, even though the IAT is sort of picking up something that is shifting in our heads. On sexuality, I think Hollywood made all the difference. And I think they just put on television day after day individuals who were gay, who were smarter and cooler and nicer than straight people, and grandmothers and grandfathers changed. I agree.
That's a great, cautiously optimistic note to end on. Thank you very much for your time, Mahzarin.
Thank you for having me, Adam. Thank you for doing this.